Hello and welcome back to the next video in our series where we have begun exploring the Visual Basic Application Program Language. In the last video, we discovered what exactly is the VBA language, and we also walked through how to enable the Developer tab. With the Developer tab enabled, we can now access the Visual Basic Editor where we can now create and write code. In this video, we are going to discuss two different topics. The first topic is going to center around the Visual Basic Editor. So we're going to see how it's laid out, the different commands and functions that exist within it, and also how we can customize it to meet our needs. In the second portion of the video, we are going to explore the macro recorder. So we're going to record a macro and then see the code that is produced from that recording. So for the first section, we need to access the VBA editor. To access the editor, we need to go to our ribbon and make sure we're on the developer section of the ribbon. Once we are here, we'll go to the far left section under code and we'll click the Visual Basic icon. A new window will pop up and we are now officially in the Visual Basic editor. Let's begin exploring the layout. Right away, we'll see there's a couple windows. The main and largest window is our code window. With the code window, we can create and edit code. So for example, if I wanted to, I can create a subroutine in this code window. I'll call it my first code. And if I wanted to, I could just do like a message box that says, hello there. And if I run it, it works. So again, the code window is where we write and edit code. Say I have existing code. Well, then what I would need to do is go to the next window. The next window is our Project Explorer. Our Project Explorer contains all the active projects that we currently have open in Excel application. So all the VBA projects. Currently, I have two projects. The first one is Book 1. That's just my current workbook. And the second project is my personal macro workbook. I will explain what the personal macro workbook is later in this video. Within each project, there are different types of objects. The first group of objects is the Microsoft Excel objects. The second group of objects are the modules. Modules contain just subroutines. So for example, these code. And a module can contain multiple subroutines. So for example, in module 1 now, there are 2 subroutines. I can also add code to individual Excel objects. So for example, I now have code that exists within the actual worksheet itself. We'll see later, but this is actually very handy if we only want code to run during certain events that take place within that particular Excel object. So for example, I could write this code to maybe only appear during a cell selection change within that particular worksheet. The same also goes for my workbook. I can add code here. There are also 2 other groups of objects that we can add. The second one is forms. So those are user forms that we can create using VBA. And that's where we can either, ask for information from the user or display information from the user in customized forms. We also have class modules where we can create our own new objects within the Excel VBA model. However, that's a more complicated concept and we're going to explain that later down the road in a different video. But do keep in mind that those are groups of objects that we can manipulate. Some common things I can do from the Project Explorer is I can insert new user forms, modules, and class modules. I can also import files that maybe a friend has given us. So for example, if you have a friend who has a macro and they want to share it with you, you could import that macro to the VBA editor using the import file function. Maybe you have a macro you want to share. You can export that macro by just doing the export file. You can also remove modules from your VBA project if you so choose. But keep in mind, a dialog box will pop up asking if you want to export that module before you remove it. So for example, if I say to remove it, it will ask me if I want to export it. You should always click yes. So that does it for the Project Explorer. In the next window, we are going to explore the Properties window. The Properties window will change depending on which object I have selected in my project. So for example, I now have Module 1 selected, and one of the properties I can change about it is its name. So I can change it to my first module, and I'll see that the name has now changed up at top. If I select different Excel objects that exist in my project, I can see all the properties that I can change about that particular object. Same with the workbook. So these are all the properties that I can change about that workbook object. So the properties window is where we can change the different properties of a given object within our VBA project. That does it for the windows. So let's go and see the top section of the VBA editor. You'll notice it's divided into two sections. The top section is called the menu bar, and the bottom section is called the toolbar. The menu bar has different drop-down menus where we can do different commands like save, import, export, remove, and print. So these are sometimes the same exact functions that we have down in our Project Explorer, but now they're just at the menu. We also have the ability to copy, cut, paste, clear, find and replace, indent, outdent. So lots of different basic commands. I can also jump to different windows from the menu bar. I can also customize my toolbar. I can insert a procedure, a user form, a module, and a class module. So for example, I can add a new procedure and I'll call it my second code. And it will create that subroutine for me. So very convenient. I can also do aligning. This is all more related to user forms. So this is just making sure that things are aligned a certain way or spaced equally. This is more, again, related to user forms. I can compile VBA projects from the menu bar. I can step into my code. I can toggle breakpoints. I can clear breakpoints. So lots of different options. I can run my code, pause my code, reset my code, and then go into the design mode where I can create user forms. I have tools. The first one is references. This is where I can enable different object libraries and then use those objects within my VBA code. Very convenient. I can also set different properties about my project. For example, I can add a password if I want. I can change the project name, project description, I can add help files, and other things. I can also customize my VBA editor from the tool section, the options, but that's the second part. I can manage add-ins, can arrange my windows and see all my windows, and also get some help related to the VBA editor. In the second part of the ribbon, we now have the command bar. So these are where the tools are. These are, again, very similar commands that we have from the drop-down menu. So things like save, insert our user form, view Microsoft Excel, paste, find, undo, run, pause, reset, design. So again, lots of very similar ones. We can even access things like our object browser. The object browser contains all the objects that we have available to us within the Excel application itself. If we want, we can go to a specific library and see those objects that are related to that library. And if we select a particular object, we can see all the properties, methods, and events that belong to this object. So very handy for just trying to understand the different objects we have. I can also customize my toolbar. So for example, if I right-click, go down to Customize, I'll see a group of commands that I can add to my toolbar. They are organized by different categories. So for example, maybe I want to add the import file to my toolbar. I just hold and click, drag it to the toolbar, release, and now I have it. If I want to remove it, I just drag it and remove it. So again, the main section is divided into two parts, the menu bar and the toolbar. So now that we've done that, let's see how we can customize the VBA editor to meet our needs. First, I'm going to go in here and then just add some code because it makes it a little bit easier to see kind of what we're customizing. And from here, if I want to customize the VBA editor, I'm going to go up to Tools, down to Options, and then a new window will pop up. Let's start at the last one first. This is the docking properties of our windows. If a window is dockable, it means that when we set it to the VBA editor, it will be locked in place. So for example, it would lock this Project Explorer window to the left side of my VBA editor. Same with the properties window and the code window. If it's not dockable, it means that we basically let it free float. So it won't be locked to any particular side. It will kind of just be floating around in the middle of the VBA editor. So for example, if you had unchecked this, then you could do that. I'm not going to do it in this video because then it kind of messes it up and it takes a little bit to get it back to normal. But just keep in mind, if you have this unchecked, it means that you can have that particular window free floating in the VBA editor. The next section is General. The first section of the General section is Form Grids. This is just more saying how you want your actual grid related to user forms to be set up, so you can actually set how you want the lines and the grids to appear. It's kind of more related to user forms. We can set different things related to error trapping. So for example, if any errors are detected, break on any errors. We can also break on only errors that happen in class modules, so this one's more specific. Or we can break on unhandled errors. So in other words, if there is an error that happens in our code, but we don't have a procedure in place to handle that type of error, then it will break. This is the default one. We can also specify how we want to compile our code. So for example, we always have it by default set on compile on demand. That means in the background it will compile your code for you. If you didn't have this set, then you would have to go up to the debug tool and you would have to compile your code yourself. The show tooltips is basically related to the icon. So for example, if I hover over this, it will give me a tooltip and say, hey, this is the design mode one. If that box is unchecked, that little design mode box would not appear. Collapse project hide windows. So if I have this enabled and I close my window, it will collapse all my macros. Keep in mind, I have a lot of them, so sometimes it will be delayed. So I don't like to do that. I like to keep that set off. The next section is the editor format section. This is where we can change how our code appears in the code window. So we can change the type of font it is, the size of that font. We can determine if we want a margin to appear on the side. So this little bar right here. We can change the forecolor of the font, the background color, and the indicator color. The indicator is this little thing right here. So this appears in the margin. So if I change the color here, it will change that little circle. I can also change it to a particular category. So I can basically have it where I can change certain types of text within my code. So not all the code itself, but very specific portions of my code. Things like selection text, keyword text, comments, very specific. The final section of the editor options is, the final section of the options that we can customize is the editor section. And it's broken into two parts, code settings and Windows settings. The Windows setting, the first one is drag and drop text setting. So for example, if I highlight this code, I can now drag and drop it, and it will rearrange it. If I was to uncheck that box, I can no longer do that. I can no longer drag and drop my text. It's preference, but I like to keep it on. The default to full module view mode will basically make it where I can only see one subroutine at a time in my code window. So if this is off, I will only see my one subroutine in this module. If I want to go to the second subroutine in my module, I have to click the drop down and then click the next one. No, I just realized I named them the same ones. So if I change it, it's kind of more clear now. But now we see that there's two subroutines. So this allows me to switch between them. I like to keep this one on because it's helpful. The next one is the procedure separator. So this line right here, if I uncheck it, I won't see that line. Again, I like to keep that on. The upper section of the editor component, the first one is auto syntax. If I don't have this checked, then when I commit a syntax error, a dialog box will not pop up. So currently, if I uncheck it, press OK, and then write some code that is purposely wrong, it will highlight that code, but no dialog box will pop up. But if I go back, check it, press OK, and then rewrite this code, a dialog box will now pop up, letting me know that I've committed a syntax error. The next one is require variable declaration. I always keep this on. This will require you to declare any variables that you use in your code in the beginning of your subroutine. So in other words, you can't have free roaming variables. They have to have a type associated with them. So for example, if this is on, if it's off, and I do this, I could run this code. However, if I was to put this on, and then let's just say, because normally when we have it on and we create a new subroutine, it would put something like this. At the top of my code, and if I try to run it now, I get an error saying, hey, wait a minute, there is no code that I can write. So basically it's returning an error saying that this variable has not been defined. So again, you should always keep that on. Auto list member is basically IntelliSense. So IntelliSense will help you basically complete your line of code. So when you write a line of code, it will recommend how to finish that particular line of code. I like to keep it on, but what it looks like is when I start writing a new line of code, so for example, range A1, and if I press dot, I will see all the different options I could associate with that range object. So all the methods and properties that are associated with it. If I didn't have that enabled, I wouldn't see this little drop-down box. So I wouldn't be able to see all the methods and properties associated with that object. So I like to keep that one on as well. The other one is quick info. So this is this little box. So this basically tells us the little parameters that we can pass through this particular object. Again, I like to keep that on as well. The next one is data tips. So that's related to when your code is in break mode. It will kind of help you guide you through and say, hey, this is what's happening at each point of your code. So if you go over a particular variable, it will tell you at that point in the code, what is your variable equal to? So for example, if my variable x was equal to 10 and I ran my code and then I added another 10 to it and then it failed on the next one and I went to go look at x, it would say, oh, well, it's actually worth 20 now. So it just gives us information when we're in break mode. I like to keep it on because it is helpful. And then auto indent, that's self-explanatory. It just automatically indents your code for you. So that does it for the customizing of the VBA editor. So now we should have a decent understanding of kind of what's in the VBA editor, how it's laid out, the different commands and functions, and how we can customize it. So in the second part, we're going to actually record a macro. So I'm going to close my VBA editor. And I'm going to go back to my Excel workbook. And from here, we're going to record a macro. A macro is simply a recording of all the events that take place within a particular time frame in your Excel application. So in my last video, I told you that VBA was an event-driven language. So that means in this application, Excel is waiting for events to take place. The macro recorder is simply recording all the events that take place from when we start the recording to when we end the recording. However, we do have to keep in mind that every single event will be recorded, even unnecessary ones. So what we'll find is that the code that is produced from a macro recording is very fat. And a lot of times we can dramatically reduce the number of lines of code in that macro. If I want to record a macro, I simply go up to my developer tab. And again, I go to the far left section and I go up to record macro. If I click it, a new window will pop up. And I got to pass through some information. The first one is the macro name. So in this case, my first macro. I can always assign a shortcut key to it. In this situation, I'm not going to, but you could if you wanted to. So maybe like Control A, and then every time you press Control A in this workbook, that macro would run. The next part is where I want to store this macro. I can either store it in a new workbook, in the workbook that I'm currently in, or a special workbook called my personal macro workbook. The personal macro workbook is an Excel workbook that is opened every time Excel is open, but it's hidden in the background, so we can't see it and play around with it. But that personal macro workbook houses all of our macros that we've recorded. And so what that allows us to do is we can now use macros that we've recorded previously in other workbooks. So it means that we're not isolated to just using that macro in that specific workbook. We can now use it across all of our workbooks in Excel. There are pros and cons to that, but we have to keep in mind that we will have to write our code a little bit differently. It's just important to keep that one in mind. So in this situation, I'm just going to put it in this workbook, and then I can also put a description. This is my first macro. And once I press OK, the macro will start recording. So from this point forward, any event that takes place within Excel, it will be recorded. Things like selecting a cell, things like scrolling up and down, things like adding a sheet, changing cell values, doing any type of formatting, alignment, if I do any merging and centering. So anything, any kind of event that takes place, it will be recorded by this macro recorder now. If I go back to the developer tab and I press stop recording, my macro is done. So any of the events I do now will not be recorded. If I want to see the code that was associated with that macro, I'm just going to go back up to my Visual Basic Editor, click it, and I'll see that there's a new module that's been added to my project. If I double click it, I will see all of the code that was recorded. Now right away, it's very intimidating because you'll just see all of this code and you're like, oh my God, this is so much code. But what we'll find is that 90% of this code can be removed. So a lot of times it's extra fluff. It's not actually doing anything meaningful for us. It's just kind of there. So for example, one thing that you can automatically do is like for the background color, you can actually move that, and then other things is like, hey, for example, you could actually move that and condense it to one line. You could condense this to one line. So right away, you can kind of tell that we've already removed a couple lines that were completely unnecessary. Don't care about the selection, anything like that. So again, macros are nice because again, they are able to repeat themselves, so we can take that code and use it again. But a lot of times what we'll find is it's fat. You know, there's a lot of stuff here that we don't really need. We can also see that it added the description, added the name, and if we had a shortcut key, it would have been assigned to it as well. So that is how you record a macro, and that actually finishes up this video. So if you have any questions about what we went over today, or just VBA in general, please put them down in the comments below, and I'll try to get back to you and answer them. And if you could, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. When you like the video, it helps other people find the video. So if you thought it was good and you want other people to find it, liking it makes sure that they find it. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again, guys.